So, today we're going to deconstruct a pretty interesting modern fable called The Tale of the Green Farm and the Borrowed Fangs. It's a story that's absolutely packed with symbolism, and in this explainer, we're going to unpack it all, piece by piece. Now, just to be super clear before we jump in, our goal here is to analyze the structure and the symbolism of this specific story. We're digging into how the narrative is built. We are not stating facts or taking sides on anything happening in the real world. We're simply explaining the source material as it's written. So here's our roadmap. We're going to walk through the 6 parts of this fable, starting with the winter in the dark forest and ending with the forest's hypocritical roar. Let's dive in. All right, Chapter 1, Winter in the Dark Forest. The story kicks off by painting a really bleak picture of this oppressive world, and it sets up the core conflict right from the get-go. So in this dark forest, you've got a clear pecking order. The big predators, lions, tigers, you name it, are in charge. But the hyenas, they're total outcasts. And what the story really hammers home is that they're hunted not because of the food chain, but out of pure hatred and fear, leading to these brutal cleansings. And all of this leads to a huge decision, the one that really sets the whole plot in motion. The big bosses of the forest decide the hyenas have got to go. But they don't want to seem weak, so they come up with a clever plan to send them somewhere else entirely. Which brings us to Chapter 2, The Promised Farm's Deception. This is where the whole scene shifts and we see a pretty big deception start to unfold. And where are they headed? To this place called the Green Farm, which is described as a total paradise where all these different animals live together in peace. The plan is kind of sneaky. Instead of sending in warriors, the forest beasts send hyena pups, who look tiny and harmless, showing up on these old ships looking like poor, desperate refugees. And this quote, which comes from an Arabian horse in the story, it really captures that initial compassionate response from the farm's residents. They see these seemingly helpless little pups and decide to offer them a small piece of land. And this single act of kindness, well, it becomes a major turning point. All right, Chapter 3, The Rise of Iron Fangs. This is where everything changes. The whole dynamic on the farm is about to get completely turned on its head. Now, according to this fable, the hyena's transformation doesn't just happen on its own. While the farm animals are asleep, both literally and figuratively, the big players from the dark forest are secretly arming the hyena pups. These iron fangs are the game changer, turning these supposedly helpless refugees into a force to be reckoned with. And then, the fable lays out this really quick, almost step-by-step takeover. The pups grow up, and their true nature comes out. They launch a surprise attack, not just for a meal, but for the land itself. They declare the farm as their ancient homeland, and start kicking the original animals out of their homes, an event the story calls the Great Dispersion. And that brings us to Chapter 4, The Game of the Victim. Now that the hyenas have taken over, the story delves into the strategy they supposedly use to hold on to their power. Yeah, this slide right here really gets to the core irony of this chapter. The story goes that whenever the hyenas face any pushback, they cry out to the whole forest that they're the victims, that everyone wants to destroy them. But the fable contrasts that with what it calls the reality on the ground, a slow and steady expansion taking over one pen after another, day by day. So how do they make all this official? Through something called peace papers. The fable paints these less like real peace deals and more like documents that were forced on the farm animals. These papers make the hyenas' games look legitimate, they strip the original residents of any means of defense, and, crucially, they do absolutely nothing to stop the hyenas from building more walls and taking even more land. Okay, Chapter 5, The Last Corner's Kick. We're at the climax of the story now, focusing on the very last pocket of resistance left on the farm. Now, the story specifically points out that 75 autumns have gone by, and that's not just a random number, right? It's there to show you that decades of pressure and conflict have been building up to this one single moment. So the situation has become incredibly dire. All that's left of the original farm is one tiny stable where the last of the horses are trapped. They're under siege, surrounded by barbed wire, completely cut off from food and water. And the way the story frames it, the horses are facing this impossible choice between 2 kinds of death. They can either die slowly of starvation, or they can die fighting for what the fable calls their dignity. This is how the source material sets up their very next move.
So at dawn, it happens. The lead horse delivers this one great kick. It smashes the fence, an act of sheer desperation that catches the hyenas completely off guard and finally breaks the long siege.
And that leads us to our final chapter, the forest's hypocritical roar. This part is all about the aftermath and the reaction from the outside world, especially from the very beasts who started this whole thing.
And here it is. This is the reaction. The lions and tigers from the dark forest, the same ones who used to hunt the hyenas, they just erupt with outrage. They frame the horse's desperate act of breaking a siege as some kind of unprovoked attack on a gentle, peaceful hyena. The story presents this as the ultimate hypocrisy.
So the fable doesn't leave you guessing. It wraps up by laying out its key messages, loud and clear. First, that a plea for sympathy can actually be a cover for a destructive plan. Second, that powerful outsiders often get involved not out of love, but to keep a conflict going for their own reasons. And finally, that a long, long history of aggression can be totally forgotten the second the victim finally fights back. And to wrap it all up, the source uses this really powerful analogy, the snowball. It says this all started as a small thing, a little plea for a safe corner. But with a push from outside forces, that little snowball started rolling downhill, getting bigger and bigger, until it became an unstoppable avalanche that just wiped out the entire farm. And that really brings us to our final thought for today. We've just broken down one particular fable, a story built with metaphors to explain a complex situation. It really leaves us with a pretty big question. How do these kinds of powerful stories, these allegories, no matter what their viewpoint is, actually shape the way you and I see reality?